Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something really interesting. Can our DNA tell us about how far we might go in school or, how well we might do?
Yeah, it's a big question.
We're driving into educational attainment. That's things like years of schooling and qualifications and educational achievement, which is more about grades and test scores.
Exactly.
Mm.
And what's fascinating, I think, is that we're not just speculating here.
Right.
Our conversation today is built on a meta-analytic review. Think of that as a big study that looks at the results of, well, lots of smaller studies on the same topic.
Okay.
In this case, the link between our genes and education. We sifted through a pile of research in genomics and education to bring you what seems most important right now.
Our goal today, especially for you, the learner, is to really understand what the science says about using DNA to predict these educational outcomes.
Hmm.
We want to explore what's possible, but also get a clear picture of what we know and what we don't, all without getting, bogged down in overly complicated details.
Pleasure.
In many ways, in societies that value hard work and talent, how well you do in education often helps you get more opportunities. So attainment and achievement are pretty connected.
They really are.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at how much of a role our genes seem to play in educational outcomes, this idea of heritability.
It's quite remarkable, actually. The main way researchers have investigated this is through twin studies.
Right, comparing twins.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By comparing identical twins who share all their DNA with fraternal twins who share about half, like regular siblings, we can get an idea of how much of a trait is influenced by genes.
Okay.
And these studies consistently show that educational achievement, things like grades and test scores, is highly heritable. We're talking about, on average, around 60%.
60%.
Yeah, 60% of the differences we see in these areas being linked to inherited DNA differences.
Wow, 60% is a big number. It almost sounds like your academic fate is sealed at birth. But that can't be right, can it?
That's a really important point to clarify. Heritability doesn't mean that our genes completely determine our outcomes. It's a common misunderstanding.
Okay.
It just tells us how much of the variation we see in a trait within a particular population is due to genetic differences in that group.
Ah, the variation. Got it.
Genes and the environment are constantly interacting.
Yeah.
Think of someone who might have a natural aptitude for music, sort of a genetic predisposition.
Mm-hmm.
But if they never have the chance to learn an instrument or be exposed to music, that potential might not go anywhere.
Right. So even if someone has a genetic inclination for, say, being good at languages, if they grow up in an environment where they only speak one language and have no access to language learning,
Yeah.
that genetic influence won't be the only factor.
Exactly. It needs the right environment to flourish. And what's particularly interesting is that the heritability of achievement tends to increase as we get older.
Really? Why is that?
Well, it's not just that your genes nudge you in a certain direction, but as you act on those inclinations, like a child with a natural curiosity for science, seeking out science books,
They choose environments that suit their genes.
precisely, you're actively shaping your environment in a way that further reinforces those genetic tendencies. This creates a powerful snowball effect as you get older. This is what we call gene-environment correlations, or RGE.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about achievement. What about educational attainment? Like how many years someone spends in school or the qualifications they get? Is that heritable too?
Yes, it is, but meta-analyses actually suggest a slightly lower heritability for educational attainment.
Lower than achievement?
Yeah, somewhere in the range of 40 to 43%.
Okay. Why the difference?
Well, the thinking here is that achievement is often measured in more standardized environments. Students in the same classroom usually take the same tests.
Sure. More controlled?
But educational attainment reflects a much wider range of experiences and choices influenced by many more external factors.
Like life choices, opportunities.
Exactly. Someone who goes to university has a very different path than someone who enters a trade directly after secondary school. This greater variety in environments likely contributes to this slightly lower heritability figure for attainment.
This idea of heritability is really thought-provoking. One thing that stood out in the sources is this seemingly paradoxical point about equality of opportunity. Can you explain that a bit more?
Absolutely. It's a bit counterintuitive. The argument is that if you have a situation where opportunities are very unequal,
Like based on wealth or where you live?
right, access to quality education is limited to certain groups. In that case, environmental factors will be the primary drivers of differences in educational outcomes.
Makes sense. Environment matters more when it's unequal.
But if you could somehow create a truly level playing field where everyone has the same high-quality educational opportunities,
Which is a big if.
a very big if, then genetic differences between individuals might account for a larger proportion of the remaining variation in how well people do.
So more equal environments could make genetic differences stand out more.
In a way, yes. In such an idealized scenario, high heritability could be seen as an indicator that we've actually removed many of the environmental barriers to success.
That's a bit of a mind bender. It feels counterintuitive that more equality and opportunity could highlight genetic inequality.
It is a complex idea. The sources use the analogy of height again. Height is very heritable, around 80%. Yet, the average height of people has increased significantly over the last century.
Right, better nutrition, mainly.
Exactly, due to environmental improvements. The genetic potential for greater height was always there, but the environment allowed it to be expressed more fully across the population.
Yeah.
Similarly, we've seen massive increases in average years of schooling over time, not because our genes suddenly changed, but because access to education became much broader.
Right, policy changes, societal shifts.
Correct. So a high heritability doesn't mean a trait can't be significantly influenced by the environment at the population level. The average can still shift dramatically.
Okay, so genes play a significant role, maybe 40–60% depending on the outcome, but they don't dictate everything, and our environment is crucial.
That's the key takeaway on heritability.
Now, how do we move from understanding this heritability to actually trying to predict these outcomes using someone's DNA? That's where polygenic scores come into play, right?
Exactly. Polygenic scores, you might also hear them called PRS or PGI, genetic risk scores, sometimes genome-wide scores.
Right.
Lots of names.
Okay, PRS is common.
Yeah, PRS is probably the most common acronym. They're essentially estimates of an individual's genetic predisposition for a particular trait, in this case, educational attainment or achievement.
How are they calculated?
They're calculated by looking at many, many small inherited DNA differences called SNP single nucleotide polymorphisms.
SNPs, okay.
These SNPs have been identified through large studies called genome-wide association studies, or GWS.
GWS, got it.
Each of these SNPs is given a weight based on how strongly it appears to be associated with the trait in the big GWAS study. Then, for an individual, you look at their specific SNPs, apply the weights, and add them all up to create their polygenic score.
So it's like adding up all these tiny genetic influences, these weighted SNPs, to get an overall score that gives us an idea of someone's genetic likelihood for doing well in education.
That's a good way to think about it, a summary score. But it's really, really important to remember that just like heritability, polygenic scores are probabilistic, not deterministic.
Right, not destiny.
Absolutely not. A high polygenic score for educational attainment doesn't guarantee a university degree, and a low score doesn't mean someone can't achieve one. It reflects a genetic propensity, a tendency.
Can you give an example of how that propensity might work?
Sure. Someone with a higher genetic propensity for educational achievement might, for instance, find certain aspects of learning, like concentrating for extended periods on homework, a bit easier. Or maybe they get more satisfaction from tackling difficult problems. It's subtle nudges.
Okay. And are these polygenic scores purely measuring direct genetic effects on, say, brain function related to learning?
That's a great question. Not entirely. It's more complex. Polygenic scores also capture what we talked about earlier, those gene-environment correlations.
Where genes influence the environments we choose or experience.
Exactly. They also reflect something called assortative mating.
Which is?
The tendency for people with similar traits, including traits influenced by genes like educational attainment, to partner up and have children. This can concentrate certain genetic variants in families over generations.
Okay, so partner choice plays a role.
It seems to. And they can also be influenced by population stratification.
Stratification.
Which are basically systematic genetic differences between different ancestral groups, which might correlate with environmental or social differences too. It makes comparisons tricky.
So the score isn't just genes for learning, it's mixed up with environment, partner choice, ancestry.
That's right. The sources suggest that these indirect factors, the gene-environment correlation, assortative mating, population stratification, might actually account for a significant portion, perhaps up to 60%, of what polygenic scores predict for educational outcomes.
Wow, up to 60%. That's a pretty big chunk that isn't directly about genes influencing learning itself.
It is, and it's a really active area of research trying to disentangle these different influences.
Okay. So let's talk about how well these polygenic scores actually work when it comes to predicting educational outcomes. The outline mentions GWS progress in educational attainment.
Right. There have been 4 major GWS that have looked specifically at the number of years people spend in education, and the scale of these studies has just exploded.
How big are we talking?
Well, the first one, maybe a decade or so ago, involved around 130,000 participants. The most recent one included data from about 3 million people.
3 million. Wow, that's a huge jump. And what impact have these much larger studies had on how well polygenic scores can predict educational attainment?
We've seen a clear improvement in predictive power. The first GWs could only explain a very small fraction of the differences we see in educational attainment, something like 2%.
Tiny.
Yeah, really small. But as the sample sizes have increased, so has the percentage of this variation that the polygenic scores can account for. The latest GWs, based on those 3 million people, can explain around 14%.
So from 2% to 14%, that's a big leap, but still leaves a lot unexplained compared to the heritability estimates, right?
Absolutely. This increase highlights what's known as missing heritability.
Missing heritability.
Is the gap between what twin studies suggest is heritable, remember, around 40% for attainment, and what we can currently explain with the specific genetic variants, the SNPs, we've identified through GWs, which is now up to about 14%.
So where's the rest of it?
Well, larger studies like the latest GVOLs are likely helping us uncover more of these contributing genetic factors, including perhaps rarer variants that you just can't detect reliably without massive samples. There are other potential reasons too, like complex gene interactions or maybe limitations in how we measure things.
It's like we're slowly piecing together the genetic puzzle of educational attainment, and bigger studies give us more pieces, clearer pieces maybe?
That's a good analogy. And each subsequent GWAS generally builds upon the previous ones, incorporating more data, refining the findings, so the earlier ones become less current fairly quickly.
Okay. Now, the meta-analysis we're focusing on for this deep dive used the results from the third major GWOS, the one by Lee and colleagues in 2018. That involved around 1 million participants, right? Why that particular study?
That's right, about 1.2 million.
Yeah.
At the time this meta-analysis was conducted, the detailed result, what we call the summary statistics, the SNP weights, basically from that third GWAS, were the most widely available to the research community for use in other studies.
Ah, okay. Accessibility.
Exactly. While the fourth GWAS, the one with 3 million people, is more powerful in terms of the amount of variation it explains, access to its detailed data was still somewhat limited when the researchers were doing this meta-analysis.
So they used the best widely available data at the time. And what kind of predictive power did the scores from that third GWAS have?
The polygenic scores derived from that third GWAS, Lee et al., could explain around 11% of the variation in educational attainment and about 16% in educational achievement.
Okay, 11% and 16%. Still sounds maybe abstract. Do those percentages actually mean anything tangible in someone's life?
Yeah, that's a fair question. The sources point out that it can translate to noticeable differences. For example, someone with a polygenic score in the bottom 10% might, on average, achieve a grade roughly equivalent to a C+ at the end of compulsory schooling in the UK system.
Okay.
Whereas someone in the top 10% for the polygenic score might be more likely to achieve around an A on average.
C+ versus A, that's quite a difference.
It is. And when you compare that to other factors that we know influence educational outcomes, think about the quality of the school a child attends.
Right. Often seen as hugely important.
It is important, but studies suggest that after accounting for other influences like family background, differences between schools explain less than 1% of the variation in those same end-of-school grades.
Less than 1% for school quality versus 16% for the polygenic score for achievement.
Exactly. So when you put it in that context, the predictive power of polygenic scores, even from that third GWAS, starts to look quite significant statistically.
That really puts it into perspective. So what were the main findings of this meta-analysis that brought together all these different studies using that third GWAS?
The primary goal was to assess how consistently and how strongly polygenic scores based on that GWAS predicted both educational attainment and achievement across a range of different research studies, different samples.
And what did they find overall?
The overall association they found, which is represented by a statistical measure called, it's like a correlation coefficient, was 0.27. 0.27 for educational attainment.
Okay, 0.27.
And 0.24 for educational achievement.
0.24. And how should we interpret those numbers?
The researchers themselves describe these as sizable effect sizes in the context of social science research. They suggest a meaningful statistical relationship, clearly more than zero.
Okay, sizable. But I noticed in the summary of the meta-analysis, it mentioned significant heterogeneity. What does that mean in this context?
That's a really important point. Crucial, actually. While there was an overall association, the strength of that association wasn't the same across all the individual studies included in the meta-analysis.
So it varied a lot.
There was a fair bit of variability, yes. This heterogeneity is critical because it tells us that the strength of this genetic prediction isn't uniform. It's not the same everywhere, for everyone.
Why is that important?
It suggests that other factors we haven't fully accounted for are influencing how well these scores work in different groups of people or in different educational settings, or maybe based on how the studies were done.
And the meta-analysis tried to dig into what some of these other factors might be, right? They looked at these moderating factors.
Exactly. They tried to see what might explain some of that variation between studies.
And what did they find?
One of the most significant factors they identified was the ancestry of the people in the study sample.
Ah, ancestry again.
Yes, the predictions were noticeably stronger in samples of European ancestry compared to, for example, African American samples. This was particularly true when looking at educational attainment.
Why would that be?
It's likely because the original GWS, the big study used to create the scores, was itself overwhelmingly composed of people of European ancestry. So the genetic markers identified might just work better or be better tagged in populations similar to the discovery sample.
Okay, so the tool was built mostly on one group and works best in that group.
That seems to be the case. Interestingly, when the researchers used statistical methods to try and account for this ancestry difference, the underlying association actually appeared to be even stronger for both attainment and achievement.
Stronger? How does that work?
It suggests that after adjusting for the measurement differences due to ancestry, the actual relationship between the genetic factors captured by the score and educational outcomes might be even more substantial. The adjusted row was 0.29 for attainment and a quite large 0.50 for achievement.
0.50. That's a large effect size in psychology.
It is, but, and this is key, even after accounting for ancestry, a significant amount of that heterogeneity, that variability across studies, remained unexplained.
So ancestry explains some of the difference between studies, but not all of it.
Not by a long shot.
That really highlights the need for more genetic research in diverse populations, doesn't it?
Absolutely critical. We can't assume findings from one group just translate directly to others.
Were there other moderating factors that emerged from the meta-analysis?
Yes, specifically for educational achievement, a couple of other things seem to make a difference.
Like what?
The age at which someone's achievement was measured mattered. The predictions were stronger when achievement was assessed during adolescence compared to earlier in childhood.
Which fits with what you said earlier about heritability increasing with age.
Exactly. It aligns well with that idea of gene-environment correlations becoming more prominent over time.
Okay. What else for achievement?
Also, the way educational achievement was measured played a role. Polygenic scores appeared to be better at predicting school grades than scores on standardized tests.
Grades versus tests. Any idea why?
It's speculative, but grades often reflect performance over a longer period, potentially capturing things like motivation, conscientiousness, classroom behavior, which might themselves have genetic influences that contribute to the overall score. Standardized tests might be more focused on pure cognitive ability at a single point in time.
Interesting distinction.
And what was really interesting here, once they took into account the age of assessment and the type of achievement measure used, grades versus tests, the impact of sample ancestry on the predictions for achievement was no longer statistically significant.
So for achievement, age and measurement type seemed more important moderators than ancestry, ones considered together.
That's what this analysis suggested, yes. But just like with educational attainment, even after considering these factors, a considerable amount of the variability across different studies still remained unexplained. There's still mystery there.
This really emphasizes that while there's a signal there with polygenic scores, it's definitely not a simple one-size-fits-all predictor, and there are still a lot of nuances we don't fully understand.
Precisely. Context matters hugely.
The strong focus on European ancestry in the research samples also seems like a really significant limitation we need to keep highlighting.
Oh, absolutely. It is a striking bias. The meta-analysis found that only about 15% of the total number of individuals across all the studies included were of non-European ancestry.
Only 15%.
Yes. And the majority of those non-European samples were from the U.S., mostly African American or Hispanic participants.
And what about other parts of the world?
There was a notable absence of studies from non-weird countries.
Weird.
Yeah, it's an acronym researchers use. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So very little data from Asia, Africa, South America.
So the findings are heavily based on a specific slice of the global population.
Overwhelmingly so. Now, there are ongoing and increasing efforts to broaden the diversity of participants in genomic research, which is great. But it remains a substantial challenge due to historical reasons, issues of trust, infrastructure of funding, a whole host of factors.
And the consequences.
The consequence is that the current predictive power of polygenic scores is much less reliable and potentially even misleading when applied to individuals from non-European backgrounds.
Yeah.
The scores just haven't been validated properly in those groups yet.
And another complication mentioned was the variation in the studies themselves, like when people were born or assessed.
Right. The studies included in the meta-analysis had participants with a wide range of birth years, spanning decades, and they were assessed at many different ages. This makes it really difficult to draw any firm conclusions about how these predictions might change across generations, with societal shifts or even consistently across different stages of life.
So teasing apart age effects versus cohort effects is tricky with the current data.
Precisely. To really understand these more subtle effects, we need more research that specifically looks at these factors, how genetic predispositions might interact with societal changes across different generations, and how their influence on educational outcomes might evolve as people age, using study designs better suited for that.
Okay, so we have these scores. They predict outcomes with sizable effects, especially in some groups, but there's lots of variation, major ancestry bias, and indirect influences mixed in. This naturally leads to thinking about the ethics, right? The bioethical considerations.
Yes, and this is a really critical part of the conversation. There are significant concerns.
What are the main ones?
One major fear is that using genetic information in education could widen existing achievement gaps.
How so?
Well, imagine if resources or opportunities were directed towards students predicted to have high genetic potential, potentially leaving others behind. It could also reinforce deterministic thinking, this idea of genetic essentialism, that your genes dictate your future, which we know isn't true.
And are there protections against this kind of thing?
That's another issue. In many places, including the U.S., there's specific legislation, like Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, that protects against genetic discrimination in health insurance and employment. But
not in education.
generally, no. Education is conspicuously absent from those protections. So the legal framework to prevent misuse in schools isn't really there yet.
That seems like a major gap.
It is. And beyond potential discrimination by institutions, there are concerns about the psychosocial impact on individuals.
Like how parents or kids might react.
Exactly. If parents learn their child has a lower genetic predisposition for, say, academic success, might they feel guilt or maybe invest less effort? Or could it become a self-fulfilling prophecy for the child?
Yeah, if a child thinks they're not genetically smart, it could really damage their motivation or self-esteem.
Potentially, yes. Conversely, a high-potential label might create undue pressure. And these issues likely intersect with socioeconomic status.
How does SES fit in?
Well, access to private genetic testing is often easier for wealthier families. They might also have more resources to act on that information, whether it's seeking enrichment programs for a high-potential child or extra support for one predicted to struggle. This could exacerbate existing inequalities linked to wealth.
So the benefits, if any, might flow to the already advantaged, and the harms could disproportionately affect others.
That's a very real concern, which is why there's broad consensus among researchers, including the authors of this meta-analysis, that we should be extremely cautious about any premature individual-level application of polygenic scores in education. They're just not ready for that.
Okay, caution is needed, but are there ways to potentially harness any benefits while minimizing the risks? The outline mentions safeguarding potential benefits.
Yes, the review highlighted three main suggestions put forward in the field.
What are they?
First, better public education is crucial. We need widespread understanding about the interplay of nature and nurture, that genetic predispositions aren't deterministic, to prevent misinterpretations and fatalistic beliefs.
Making sure people understand what heritability and polygenic scores actually mean and what they don't mean.
Precisely. Second, Researchers have a responsibility here. They need to communicate their findings carefully and accessibly, not just to other scientists, but to the public, policymakers, educators, acknowledging the limitations and ethical considerations up front.
Avoiding hype and being clear about the caveats.
Yes. And third, the suggestion is to focus research not just on broad outcomes like years of schooling, but on more specific learning-related traits or difficulties.
Like what? Reading ability, math skills.
Exactly. Research into the genetic underpinnings of specific phenotypes, like dyslexia or mathematical ability, might eventually lead to polygenic scores that could, potentially, help identify children who might benefit from specific types of early support or intervention, rather than just giving a general educational potential score.
So more targeted, potentially helpful scores rather than broad, potentially problematic ones.
That's the idea. But even then, extreme caution and rigorous ethical oversight would be needed before any practical application.
Right. And there are still fundamental limitations with the schools themselves, even beyond the ethical side.
Definitely. It's important to remember that the current polygenic scores for education are still pretty blunt tools, as the review calls them.
Blunt tools.
Yeah, they predict general outcomes like overall attainment or achievement, but they don't tell you why someone might struggle or excel or what specific learning needs they might have.
So it might predict lower grades, but not whether it's due to reading difficulties or attention problems or something else entirely.
Exactly. The review draws an analogy to other broad indicators sometimes used to identify students needing support, like eligibility for free school meals or being in foster care.
Okay.
Those markers also predict educational outcomes on average, but the group of students identified by them is incredibly diverse, with vastly different underlying needs. A polygenic score is similar. It might identify a group statistically at risk, but it doesn't diagnose the specific issue or suggest the right support.
So it lacks specificity for intervention.
Right now, yes. And another major limitation we touched on earlier is that the meta-analysis, and most studies like it, couldn't really model that complex interplay of gene-environment correlation, assortative mating, and population stratification we discussed.
The things that account for maybe 60% of the prediction.
Potentially, yes.
Mm.
And findings from that latest, largest GWs actually suggest that a very substantial portion of the polygenic score's prediction for educational attainment might be due to environmental confounding that's correlated with the genes, rather than the genes directly causing the educational outcome through biological pathways.
So the environment linked to the genes is maybe doing a lot of the predictive work.
It seems increasingly likely that's a big part of the story, especially for a complex outcome like educational attainment. It makes interpreting the scores even more complicated.
Okay, so to bring it all together then, after this deep dive, what's the main thing for you, the learner, to take away from all this about using DNA to predict educational outcomes?
I think the key message is that polygenic scores do show a statistical association with both educational achievement and attainment. These associations are considered reasonably strong by researchers, maybe even large, especially within certain populations like those of European ancestry, and for certain types of educational measures like school grades.
Okay, there is a signal there.
Yes, and these are big decisions. There's still a lot of variability in these predictions across different studies that we don't fully understand. There are major issues with the lack of diversity in the research limiting generalizability. And there are significant ethical concerns and potential for misuse that haven't been resolved.
It sounds like we're seeing the early stages of understanding a very complex picture. While these tools are becoming statistically more powerful with bigger studies, they're definitely not refined or understood well enough, nor are the ethical safeguards in place for them to be used for making predictions about individuals in an educational setting.
Absolutely. That's the bottom line right now. The science is fascinating, it's progressing rapidly, but it's nowhere near ready for individual level application in schools or by parents. Much more research and societal discussion are needed.
And it reminds me of that quote from Marie Curie that the meta-analysis ended with. "Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less."
It's a great quote for this topic.
Perhaps the most important thing to consider right now, the learner, is that we are gaining a deeper understanding of the complex factors, including genetics, that contribute to educational outcomes. This knowledge itself, used responsibly by researchers, is valuable, but maybe the provocative thought to leave you with is, how do we navigate the gap between understanding these complex genetic and environmental influences and potentially applying that understanding in ways that are truly equitable and beneficial without falling into the traps of determinism or discrimination? Where is that line, and how do we ensure we stay on the right side of it as the science evolves?